This is the final part of Professor Antony Sutton's book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. And in the last video, I talked about how the history of the Federal Reserve System and the plotting of its creation can be traced through three separate stages, according to Dr. Sutton. First, the original plan created secretly on Jekyll Island in 1910, then the promotion of Woodrow Wilson for President of the United States, and third and finally, the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill through the Congress. In 1910, 6 prominent Wall Street financial men met at a place called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia to map plans for a central banking system in the United States. And the meeting involved the following men: Senator Nelson Aldrich, who is the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., German banker Paul Warburg of the German bankers M.M. Warburg of Hamburg and Keen Loeb in the United States, Henry P. Davison, partner in J.P. Morgan and chairman of Bankers Trust Company, Benjamin Strong, vice president of Bankers Trust, Frank Vanderlip, chairman of National City Bank, and Charles Norton, president of First National Bank. The last 3 banks were in the Morgan Group. Warburg represented Keen Loeb, and Aldrich represented the Rockefeller interest and the Standard Oil Group. The Harriman interest in Guarantee Trust had been absorbed into the Morgan Group after the death of Harriman. One of the participants to the meeting, Frank Vanderlip, wrote this about the secret nature of the gathering. Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. None of us who participated felt that we were conspirators. On the contrary, we felt we were engaged in a patriotic work. We were trying to plan a mechanism that would correct the weaknesses of our banking system as revealed under the strains and pressures of the Panic of 1907. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. And this was taken from a book called Farm Boy to Financier that was published in 1935. And remember that the Panic of 1907 had been precipitated by the same Wall Street firms that were able to control the booms and busts in the economy. So they created the Panic of 1907. Why? To create and convince the public that there was a need to create a federal bank in the United States. Senator Aldrich headed a Senate Monetary Commission which toured Europe in order to discuss and study European central banks, especially the German Reichsbank system. Aldrich thus emerged as the congressional expert on bank planning. Aldrich had close links with the banking interests, so there definitely was a conflict of interest there. Aldrich also was connected to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan's son-in-law commented on Aldrich's close links with this group. According to Morgan's son-in-law, Henry L. Satterlee, Aldrich turned to Mr. Morgan for advice, and then during the next 2 years, they were to spend many hours together working out an orderly pattern for the banking world of this country from coast to coast. And this is taken from a book called J. Pierpont Morgan, An Intimate Portrait. It was published in 1939. According to Satterlee, J.P. Morgan lent him, meaning Aldrich, Harry Davison, who was a Morgan partner, to help him with the details, while Paul M. Warburg, the Keen Loeb partner, also put his service at Senator Aldrich's disposal. It was key that secrecy be maintained regarding the meeting at Jekyll Island. If any Wall Street name ever became attached to a central banking bill, such as the Federal Reserve Bill, it would be destined to failure because of the public's dislike of the whole idea of central banks. Therefore, the 3 participants agreed to address each other only by their first names, and this way the staff at Jekyll Island would not know who they were. Jekyll Island was a private resort that was owned by J.P. Morgan and some of his friends. The host for the meeting was Nelson Aldrich, the senator. And for 9 days, the 6 men debated at Jekyll Island how to reform the U.S. banking and monetary systems. And of course, what they were trying to do was scheme and plan for how they would bring about another central bank in the United States. The Aldrich plan that was written by Vanderlip and Strong did not get through Congress. It was shot down, and Senator Aldrich, who was not well, then retired from office. This would not, however, be the end of the proposal to create a central bank for the United States, because the money trust wanted definitely there to be a central bank because they would be able to profit from this enormously. So they had to come up with another way to try to get a plan through Congress. This is where they hit on the idea of using Woodrow Wilson as a presidential candidate in 1912. In December 1906, Woodrow Wilson was introduced to a man by the name of Thomas Fortune Ryan. He was a member of the Copper Trust and a prominent financier. After the meeting, Wilson wrote a brief for the Wall Street establishment in which he provided academic support for the trust. From that point on, several powerful members of Wall Street, along with the aid of New Jersey political bosses, pushed for Wilson to become governor of New Jersey in November 1910. And you need to remember that Woodrow Wilson, when he was running for president, tried to make it seem as though he was an enemy of the money trust and felt as though the money trust needed to be stopped. But here we see that Woodrow Wilson himself has a lot of connections to Wall Street. National City Bank Director Cleveland Dodge was a classmate of Wilson at Princeton University. He opened a bank account in New York and an office to kickstart a campaign to get Wilson elected to the presidency. So in fact, Wilson was to be used as the stooge, if you will, and the front man that they would use in order to get their plan passed through Congress. Cleveland Dodge himself deposited the first amount of $1,000 into the account. So 2/3 of Wilson's campaign funds for the presidency came from just 7 people, all Wall Street financiers and linked to the very trust that Wilson was denouncing in public. So Wilson's campaign painted him as a man of peace and against trust. And again, the textbooks that the establishments use in schools always point out Woodrow Wilson as some kind of a hero, that he was in favor of this idea of creating a League of Nations and all of this other kind of stuff. They never mention anything at all about his connections to Wall Street. Wilson then was elected president in 1912, and the talk of currency reform began shortly after. By early 1912, a strange man by the name of Colonel Mandell House, he wasn't really a colonel, but he called himself a colonel, had already talked with key members of Congress about the need to support Wilson on this matter. Paul Warburg telephoned Colonel House on December 12, 1912, and told him the plan was ready. So they're planning for this behind the scenes. And Colonel House said in his memoirs, "I knew the president-elect thought straight about the issue." And this is taken from a book written by Charles Seymour, The Intimate Papers of Colonel House, 1926. The interesting thing about Colonel House is that Wilson, who's pictured on the left here, described Mandell House as his second personality. And he said, his thoughts and my thoughts are one. And it's a very strange relationship between the two of them because, of course, Colonel Mandell House wasn't elected to any public office, yet he was one of Wilson's chief advisors, especially on foreign policy. And he had a lot of connections to banking interest abroad and also to Cecil Rhodes' roundtable groups, which were very much involved in the colonization of Africa. So in March 1912, Frank Vanderlip talked with Colonel House, and 2 weeks later, a group of bankers arrived at the White House with a printed currency reform bill for Wilson to present to Congress. House suggested it wouldn't be a very good idea to present a pre-printed reform bill because obviously then it's going to look like they came up with this and just gave it to Wilson and that it wasn't his idea. So the Federal Reserve Act that they originally conceived was taken back to Wall Street and a typewritten copy was made from the printed plan. And this comes from Charles Seymour's book, The Intimate Papers of Colonel House. The next step, of course, was how do we get this Federal Reserve bill through Congress, knowing that the public is pretty much opposed to the idea of another central bank. On the issue of whether or not the public would question the close family ties among the members of the proponents of the Federal Reserve Act, who feigned disinterested impartiality, meaning they actually acted as though they were against the whole idea when really they were behind the creation of it. Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the participants at Jekyll Island, wrote, "But would the electorate have believed that? I question their ability to do so." Just to give you a faint idea, Senator Aldrich was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and himself a very rich man. Once I had written to Woodrow Wilson at Princeton inviting him to come speak at dinner. Wishing to impress him with the importance of the occasion, I had mentioned that Senator Aldrich had been invited to speak. My friend Dr. Wilson had astonished me by replying that he could not bring himself to speak on the same platform with Senator Aldrich. He did come and make a speech, however, after I reported that Mr. Aldrich's health would prevent him from appearing. Now then, fancy what sort of headlines might have appeared over a story that Aldrich was conferring about new money legislation with a Morgan partner, Davison, and the president of the biggest bank, who was Vanderlip. And of course, this is from the book From Farm Boy to Financier. So on September 18, 1913, the Glass Bill, which was the House version of the Morgan Central Banking Bill, passed the House of Representatives by an overwhelming margin of 287 to 85. Congressman Glass of Virginia was a banker, a director of the United Loan and Trust and the Virginia Trust Company. Most congressmen had absolutely no idea what this bill was all about. There were no amendments added to the bill, and members were expected to vote for or against. The Glass Bill then went to the Senate and became the Owen Bill after Senator Robert Latham Owen of Oklahoma. He was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and also a banker and a major stockholder in the First National Bank of Muskogee. The Senate took exactly 4.5 hours to debate and adopt the Owen Bill, 43 to 25. The Republicans did not even see the conference report that is normally read to the floor. No members of the Senate could possibly have known of the contents of the bill, and some senators stated on the floor of the Senate that they had no knowledge of the contents of the Owen Bill, this bill that's being rushed through the Senate. At 6:02 p.m. on the same day, the bill was hurried through the Senate without discussion, and President Woodrow Wilson obligingly signed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 into law. Normally, the process of bills going through Congress takes an inordinate amount of time, and most bills never even get through the process of the committee that they're proposed in to begin with and marked up in. So the idea that this bill was passed through both the House and the Senate with no amendments and no discussion is literally astonishing. A detailed review of the Senate debate from the congressional record indicates the senators had no details to discuss and every criticism went unanswered. Republican Senator Bristow made bitter comments on the obvious conflict of interest, the idea, of course, that the people that were pushing this were tied to the banking interest. My allegation is that this bill has been drawn in the interest of the banks, that the senator from Oklahoma, as the chairman of the committee, is largely interested in banks, that the profits that will accrue to those banks directly will add to his personal fortune, that he has voted to increase the dividends on the stock of the regional banks, which will be paid to the member banks, from 5% to 6%, that he has voted against permitting the public to hold the stock of these regional banks and has insisted that it should be held by the member banks, and that he has voted against giving the government the control of the regional banks and in favor of the banks controlling the regional banks. And it is for him to say whether he has violated the rule laid down in Jefferson's manual. And this is taken from the Congressional Record, Senate, in 1915, February 8th. Congressman Lindbergh stated on December 23, 1913, "This act," meaning the Federal Reserve Act, "established the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. Senator Townshend stated, "This bill did not originate in any party platform. The people have not expressed themselves on it anywhere and at any time." And this is taken from the congressional record also. The Federal Reserve Act transferred control of the monetary supply of the United States from Congress, where it's supposed to be, according to the Constitution, to a private elite. This is specifically something the Founding Fathers would have abhorred and never would have wanted to see come to pass. Paper fiat currency replaced gold and silver. Wall Street financiers were able now to tap an unlimited supply of fiat money at no cost. The Federal Reserve is a private system owned by the banks. Fed control over money is a private monopoly granted by Congress. Here is an official statement. Where does the Federal Reserve get the money with which to create bank reserves? This is literally from the Money Facts, which is published by the Committee on Banking and Currency in 1964 in the U.S. Congress. And it says it doesn't get the money, it creates it. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. This can result in an increase in bank reserves, a demand deposit, or in cash. If the customer prefers cash, he can demand Federal Reserve notes, and the Federal Reserve will have the Treasury Department print them. The Federal Reserve is totally a money-making machine. It can issue money or checks, and it never has a problem in making its checks good because it can obtain $5 and $10 bills necessary to cover its checks simply by asking the Treasury Department to print them. This is from an advertisement in the magazine Computer World dated July 16, 1979. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is looking to hire programmers for its computer services group. Some people think we're a branch of the government. We're not. We're the bank's bank. Robert H. Hemphill, credit manager of Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, in a foreword to a book by Irving Fisher in 1935 said, "We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. It is the most important subject intelligent persons can investigate and reflect upon. It is so important that our present civilization may collapse unless it becomes widely understood and the defects remedied very soon." And of course, that was published in 1935, and the public at large still has absolutely no idea about any of this. British Lord John Maynard Keynes, economist, said, "By this means the government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." Modern Money Mechanics Workbook, put out by the good old Federal Reserve itself, a Bank of Chicago, 1975, says, "Neither paper currency nor deposits have value as commodities. Intrinsically, a dollar bill is just a piece of paper. Deposits are merely book entries." And Henry Ford Sr. said, "The youth who can solve the money question will do more for the world than all of the professional soldiers of history." Sir Denison Miller, first governor of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, said, "This truth is well known among our principal men now engaged in forming an imperialism of capital to govern the world. By dividing the voters through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting over questions of no importance. Thus, by discreet action, we can secure for ourselves what has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished." Senator Barry Goldwater, a 5-term senator from Arizona, said, "Most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of the international moneylenders. The accounts of the Federal Reserve System have never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States." Modern Money Mechanics, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, last reprint 1994, says, "The actual process of money creation takes place primarily in banks. Bankers discovered that they could make loans merely by giving their promise to pay or banknotes to borrowers. In this way, banks begin to create money. Transaction deposits are the modern counterpart of banknotes. It was a small step from printing notes to making book entries crediting deposits of borrowers, which the borrowers in turn could spend by writing checks, thereby printing their own money. And finally, a deposit is created through lending that is a debt that has to be paid on demand of the depositor, just the same as the debt arising from a customer's deposit of checks or currency in the bank. Of course, they do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits to the borrower's transaction amounts. And to sum up, the Federal Reserve System is completely and totally unconstitutional. The Founding Fathers would be turning in their graves if they knew that we had such a thing. The stockholders of the Federal Reserve are unknown to the public. This is kept a closely guarded secret. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and it has no reserves. And this is probably one of the number one things that the American public needs to be made aware of. In schools, the establishment teaches about the Federal Reserve and how it operates, but they teach nothing about the origins of how it came about and the conspiracy that actually brought it about. So this is a topic that I think everybody should know about, and you should teach as many people as possible as you can about it, the scam that is the Federal Reserve System.